All right, settle in. Welcome to Boring Owl. You think dating in the 21st century is a cruel, unforgiving arena? You think swiping left on a guy holding a fish? Or enduring a first date that smells faintly of desperation and regret is the pinnacle of romantic misery? You've been ghosted after an emotionally vulnerable text? You've scrolled through profiles filled with questionable life choices and even more questionable selfies, only to feel a profound existential weariness settle deep into your soul. Perhaps you've even had the distinct misfortune of a partner who still believes being mysterious means not telling you where they are or if they're coming home. And maybe, just maybe, you've accidentally liked an ex's photo from 2017 while doom scrolling at 3 a.m. Oh, the humanity. The sheer, unadulterated horror of modern romance. Subscribe. Let me stop you right there with your artisanal coffee and your curated online personas and your very real, very modern anxiety about commitment, because I'm here to tell you, with the deepest sincerity and a heavy dose of sardonic glee, that you have absolutely no idea. None. Zero. You're living in a gilded cage of romantic convenience, a veritable paradise of choice and hygienic encounters, and you're complaining about the thread count of the silk sheets. Think that's bad? Let me tell you about real dating problems. Problems that involved significantly less Wi-Fi and significantly more being eaten by something with very large teeth. Today, we're taking a little stroll down memory lane, about 2 million years memory lane, back to a time when your biggest dating red flag wasn't a penchant for NFTs, but a suspicious limp or the telltale smell of rotting flesh you were wearing. We're venturing into the primordial dating pool, a cesspit of fear, filth, and fundamental misunderstandings about what a relationship even was. This wasn't just bad. It was an unmitigated, terrifying, and profoundly unpleasant ordeal that would make your worst Tinder experience feel like a candlelit dinner with Ryan Gosling. We're talking about an era where ghosting meant your date actually became a ghost, probably because a woolly mammoth sat on them, or, more likely, because you starved to death on the way to the date. So, prepare yourselves. Because we're about to explore a world where romance was a foreign concept, where courtship involved grunting and shoving, and where the only thing guaranteed was a quick, brutal end to pretty much everything. Your comfortable modern woes, they're about to look like luxurious inconveniences. This is the funny, dark, sarcastic, and utterly unromantic truth about why dating in prehistoric times wasn't just awful, it was a miracle anyone even tried. And by tried, I mean survived long enough to accidentally bump into another fertile human. Welcome to the dawn of bad dates, folks. Try not to get eaten.
All right. Let's rewind the cosmic VCR even further, beyond the relatively sophisticated early Homo sapiens, and delve into the truly primal soup of existence. We're talking Homo erectus territory now, roughly 1.8 million years ago. Forget your carefully constructed dating profiles, your witty opening lines, your agonized debates over what to wear. Here, the concept of choice was about as sophisticated as your average garden slug's internal monologue. You had two options: survive or become a very permanent part of the food chain. And dating was merely a brutal, necessary cog in that survival machine. Imagine, if you dare, a world where the very notion of attraction was nebulous, to say the least. It wasn't about a charming smile or a shared love of obscure indie films. It was about whether you looked like you could function. Could you carry a heavy stone tool without collapsing? Did your teeth still mostly reside in your skull? Did you possess all your limbs? If the answer was yes to these deeply unromantic queries, congratulations. You were technically in the running for the most basic form of genetic exchange. There was no concept of a date in any recognizable sense. No awkward small talk about the weather, though the weather was objectively terrifying. No splitting the bill. There was no bill, just dirt. And certainly no post-date debrief with your bewildered friends. It was purely, unequivocally, about procreation and perpetuating the species. Your genes were screaming into the void, desperately trying to cling to existence, and you were just the fleshy, hairy, slightly bewildered vessel. Courtship, if you could even call it that, without inviting a historical accuracy committee to club you senseless, primarily involved grunting. A lot of grunting, and perhaps some strategic shoving. Think of it less as a romantic overture and more as an aggressive territorial dispute with a reproductive goal. The subtlety of a rhinoceros mating ritual would have been considered high art. Maybe, just maybe, if you were feeling particularly avant-garde, you'd demonstrate your prowess by expertly throwing a rock. Not at your potential partner, mind you, unless you were really going for the dominant and slightly concussive vibe, but perhaps at a particularly juicy-looking wild pig or an aggressive baboon. The message wasn't, "I find you intellectually stimulating." It was, "I can procure dinner and also probably defend you from things that want to turn us into dinner." It was a primitive flexing of genetic utility, a desperate advertisement that your DNA was, for now, not entirely defective. And the stakes? Oh, the stakes were delightfully high. None of this modern, "I'll just try again next week" nonsense. Here,
It was mate, or be forgotten by the gene pool. And not just forgotten in a metaphorical, emotionally devastating way. We're talking forgotten in a literal, evolutionary dead end, probably eaten by something way. If you failed to reproduce, your genetic line evaporated faster than a puddle in a primeval drought. Your failure wasn't a personal setback. It was an extinction event for your specific brand of eyeballs and toenails. So, no pressure. Just the entire future of your species resting squarely on your ability to find someone who wasn't actively trying to eat you, and then to successfully pass on your primitive chromosomes. The brutal simplicity of it all was almost poetic. If you could successfully reproduce, if you managed to churn out a few more tiny, screaming bundles of potential future Homo erectus, you were successful. In the grand, indifferent scheme of evolution, that was the gold medal, the Nobel Prize, the coveted happily ever after. If not, well, evolution didn't care about your feelings. It didn't care about your sensitive soul, your artistic inclinations, if such a thing even existed beyond drawing stick figures in the dirt, or your profound inability to attract a mate through sheer willpower. It simply moved on, like a brutal biological algorithm, deleting your inefficient data points from the system. So next time you're lamenting a bad first date, just remember, at least your lineage isn't teetering on the brink of annihilation because your conversational skills aren't up to scratch. You're welcome. All right, let's fast forward a few 100,000 years. We're in the Paleolithic era now. Roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, dealing with our own ancestors, Homo sapiens. Congratulations, you've evolved opposable thumbs, and presumably a slightly larger vocabulary than ugh. But don't pop the champagne just yet, because dating is still a profoundly unromantic endurance test, albeit with slightly more complex social dynamics. The ultimate lack of privacy was, and I cannot stress this enough, a soul-crushing reality. Imagine your absolute most intimate moments, and by intimate, I mean anything from the indignity of answering nature's call to the desperate act of procreation, being a public spectacle. You lived in a cave, or a rock shelter, or a flimsy hide tent that offered all the soundproofing of a wet napkin. There were no separate bedrooms, no concept of a master suite, not even a strategically placed potted fern to create a sense of personal space. Everyone lived in the same communal hovel, a smoky, damp, drafty space shared with your entire hunter-gatherer band, your elders, your cousins, your extremely smelly toddlers, the tribal shaman who kept muttering to himself about bad omens, They were all right there, always. This meant your intimate moments were, by necessity, incredibly awkward and probably very quick. And they were absolutely a public spectacle. The softest grunt, the slightest rustle of animal hides, the gentle sigh of existential despair, it echoed across the cavern. There was no whispering sweet nothings, unless, hey, did you see that saber-toothed cat outside? Counts as sweet nothing? Any attempts at romantic cooing would be met with the judging stares of Aunt Helga, who was trying to get some sleep before her shift scaring away hyenas, or little Grog, who just wanted his flint knife back. Your love life was the original reality TV show, except with significantly more lice and a constant low-grade fear of imminent death. And who had the mental or physical energy for flirtation anyway? Flirtation? What even is that? Your daily grind was an exhausting, unrelenting cycle of hunting, gathering, and most importantly, avoiding being ripped limb from limb by something bigger and hungrier than you. You woke up cold, probably hungry, and often with an ache in your bones that felt millennia old. Your day was spent tracking elusive prey through treacherous terrain, digging for meager roots, chipping away at flint to make tools that might save your life, or hauling heavy carcasses back to the camp. Every calorie was precious. Every moment was about survival. Imagine coming back to the cave after a long day, having narrowly escaped a cave bear attack, your body aching, your stomach rumbling like an angry volcano, and your partner suggests Netflix and chill? Except Netflix doesn't exist, and chill probably means huddling for warmth while hoping a storm doesn't collapse your shelter. The idea of expending precious, emotional, or physical energy on flirtation or romance was a luxury beyond comprehension. It would be like trying to write a sonnet while juggling chainsaws and simultaneously diffusing a bomb. Utterly impractical. Relationships, therefore, were pragmatic partnerships for survival, not emotional connections. Imagine a marriage based solely on who's best at clubbing a rabbit. Oh, Thag is such a good provider. His clubbing technique is impeccable, and his grunts are almost endearing. Your partner wasn't your soulmate. They were your co-pilot in the terrifying, unforgiving journey of life. They were the one who had your back when a predator attacked, the one who remembered which berries were poisonous, the one whose body heat helped you survive another freezing night. Love, as we understand it, was a secondary, tertiary, or possibly even non-existent consideration. Utility was king. Shared DNA for the next generation was the ultimate goal. And the concept of alone time? That was a luxury only available if you were lost in the wilderness and probably about to die, or if you were already dead. There was no me time, no tranquil moments of introspection. If you wandered off alone, you were either a scouting party with a very specific, dangerous purpose, or you were inviting some apex predator to enjoy a solitary meal. The idea of craving solitude would have been seen as baffling, or perhaps a sign that you'd been bitten by a rabid badger. Your entire existence was communal, shared, and utterly devoid of personal space. So, the next time your partner complains about you taking too long in the bathroom, just remember, at least you have a bathroom, and a door, and the blessed ability to lock it. All right, aspiring Casanovas and siren songstresses of the modern age, let's talk about game. Specifically, the prehistoric version. Forget your carefully crafted opening lines, your witty banter honed over years of online interaction, your strategic use of emojis. In the prehistoric dating pool, smooth talk was not only unnecessary, it was probably incomprehensible. Your ability to wield a club effectively, or perhaps even more importantly, find edible roots and not accidentally poison everyone, was your absolute best asset. Your value proposition wasn't your charm or your winning personality. It was your demonstrable capacity to not immediately succumb to the harsh realities of existence. Picture this. You want to impress someone. Do you recite poetry? No. Do you buy them flowers? They'd probably eat them. Do you picture this? You want to impress someone. Do you recite poetry? No. Do you buy them flowers? They'd probably eat them. Do you offer a compliment on their carefully constructed mammoth hide outfit? Unlikely. Instead, you'd hoist your freshly sharpened stone axe, perhaps give it a little twirl, and make sure everyone saw you expertly flaying a freshly killed deer. Look upon mighty muscles honed by relentless survival. Observe my skill with this rudimentary yet effective tool. I killed this deer. You will not starve today. This was the prehistoric equivalent of arriving in a flashy sports car, except the sports car was your raw, primal strength, and the flashy part was the blood dripping from your kill. Your physical prowess wasn't just attractive, it was an advertisement that you possessed the genetic material and the practical skills to keep living. And that, my friends, was the ultimate green flag. Weakness, conversely, was a death sentence, romantically, literally, and probably existentially. If you were scrawny, if you coughed too much, if you couldn't keep up on the hunt, you were a liability. And in a world where everyone was a net drain on resources just by existing, liabilities were quickly excised. Oh, Grog's got a nasty cough again, and he tripped over that rock. You know, that rock he's tripped over 3 times this week. Probably best if we forget him at the next campsite. Sounds harsh, right? Welcome to Evolution's dating app. There was no room for dead weight, no allowance for a sensitive, artistic type who couldn't pull his own weight in the existential struggle. Your vulnerability was not endearing. It was a sign that you were about to become dinner for someone else, and you might take your potential partner down with you. So get strong or get selected out. Simple as that. The art of securing a mate often involved dominance, intimidation, or, perhaps most romantically, simply being the last one standing after a particularly nasty saber-toothed tiger attack. Imagine the scene. A chaotic melee, fur and claws flying, the screams of the unfortunate. When the dust settles, you're covered in blood, mostly the tiger's, hopefully, panting but alive. You glance over at your potential partner, who is also alive, perhaps slightly soiled, but alive. A shared look of primal terror and relief. Well, you might grunt, that was close. You still want to share this cave? And just like that, a bond is formed. Or, at least, a temporary alliance of the surviving. It wasn't about sparkling conversation. It was about shared trauma and the mutual understanding that you both possessed the grim tenacity to cheat death for another day. And here's where the dark humor truly shines. Impressing someone with your ability to fashion a marginally less uncomfortable sleeping spot. Think about it. You've spent your entire life sleeping on cold, damp earth. Maybe a few scraggly leaves, often with a rock digging into your spine. Then, one day, you come across someone who has meticulously arranged a few large, soft animal pelts, cleared away the sharpest stones, and even managed to find a spot that's somewhat sheltered from the constant biting wind. "Look, my beloved," they might exclaim with a gleam in their eye. "I have constructed a sleeping area that is only 70% likely to give you a permanent crick in your neck. And I only wrestled that cave bear for these furs for most of the day." This wasn't just impressive, it was revolutionary. It was the prehistoric equivalent of someone showing you their meticulously designed, ergonomic, climate-controlled smart home. The ability to make life even a fraction less miserable was a colossal achievement and a truly seductive quality in an age of unrelenting discomfort. So next time you're lamenting your partner's snoring, just remember,
At least you're not sharing a drafty, lice-infested rock crevice with someone who smells like death and occasionally grunts in their sleep. All right, prepare yourselves, because we're about to dive nose first into what might be the single most defining characteristic of prehistoric romance, the utterly, undeniably, soul-crushingly awful stench. This wasn't just a faint whiff of body odor, folks. This was an all-encompassing, oppressive, multi-layered miasma of raw, unadulterated prehistoric life. Imagine waking up. You haven't showered in, well, ever. Not because you're lazy, but because soap doesn't exist, and the concept of showering would probably involve standing under a freezing waterfall for purely masochistic reasons. Your hair is matted with grease, dirt, and probably some ancient bits of food. Your skin is caked with a permanent layer of grime, sweat, and the residue of whatever animal you've been butchering or whatever patch of mud you've stumbled through. You're wearing the same animal hides you wore yesterday, and the day before, and the week before that. They've absorbed every bodily effluvia, every drip of animal blood, every puff of campfire smoke, every whiff of rotting carcass you've dragged back to the cave. The perfume of the era? It was a delightful blend of stale sweat, dried blood, animal guts, a faint urine tang from various communal activities, and an underlying note of general human musk that had been marinating for millennia. It was the olfactory equivalent of a forgotten gym locker, a slaughterhouse floor, and a particularly enthusiastic composting heap, all mixed together and left to ferment under a hot sun. This was your everyday cologne, for everyone. And let's not forget the parasites. Fleas, lice, ticks, they were your constant companions, adding another layer of itch and potential disease to your already formidable aroma. So imagine a first date. You're trying to make a good impression. You present your intended with a particularly shiny flint knife, perhaps a promising-looking root. And then you lean in to deliver your most charming grunt, only to be overwhelmed by a blast of their personal scent profile. Both parties, you included, smell like a well-used latrine after a particularly bad batch of berries, mixed with the musky perfume of a forgotten fish that's been sun-drying for too long. There's no escaping it. It's in your fur, it's on your hands, it's infused into the very fabric of the air you breathe. The very act of existing in proximity to another human was an exercise in olfactory fortitude. And dental hygiene? Non-existent. Seriously, put away your toothbrushes, your floss, your mouthwash. Those are luxuries for an entirely different epoch. Your teeth were tools used for tearing meat, chewing tough plants, and perhaps cracking nuts. They were stained, chipped, and often host to a thriving ecosystem of ancient plaque and food particles. Bad breath wasn't a social faux pas, it was the norm. It was the air itself. Imagine the joy of trying to share a choice piece of mammoth liver with someone whose breath could wilt a sturdy shrub. Toothaches were a constant, agonizing threat, and without modern dentistry, a severe toothache wasn't just painful, it was a direct line to a deadly infection, swollen glands, and an early, miserable grave. Forget worrying about food getting stuck in your teeth. Worry about your teeth getting stuck in your jaw for eternity because of a runaway abscess. Now, here's the wonderfully ironic truth about all this pervasive stench. Everyone smelled terrible, and I mean everyone. There were no outliers, no secretly fresh-smelling individuals who had discovered some hidden spring of proto-deodorant. So, in a strange, twisted way, perhaps it canceled out? Perhaps the baseline for normal was so utterly repulsive that your brain simply adjusted, tuning out the constant assault of putrid aromas like white noise. Or perhaps it was just a constant low-grade torture, a background hum of disgust that everyone simply learned to live with, much like the omnipresent threat of being eaten. You certainly wouldn't be swiping left on a profile because someone described themselves as sweaty and earthy. That was just Tuesday. The idea of finding someone smells nice was as alien as finding someone who curates artisanal cheese boards. The absence of a truly horrendous, actively decaying smell might have been considered a subtle compliment. So next time you're picking out your favorite shower gel or debating between two shades of lip balm, take a moment. Breathe in the clean, sanitized air. Appreciate the fact that your date won't be silently judging your personal hygiene because, well, you actually have personal hygiene. It's a small miracle, really. A very, very fragrant miracle. All right, fashionistas and aestheticians of the present day, let's talk beauty standards. Put away your contour kits, your collagen injections, your elaborate skincare routines. Toss out the notion of flawless skin and youthful glow. In the raw, brutal world of prehistory, what actually constituted attractive wasn't about aesthetics. It was about evidence of your improbable, glorious survival. It was about screaming to the world, "Look at me, I haven't died yet. My genes are robust." First up, scars. Now, in the modern world, a scar might be a faded memory of a childhood bicycle accident or a carefully concealed badge of past surgery. But in prehistoric times, scars from animal attacks or tribal conflicts were not blemishes. They were badges of honor. They were a living, breathing testament to your tenacity, your ferocity, and your sheer bloody luck.
Oh, you survived a bear attack and only lost half an ear? Stunning. Tell me more about your genetic predisposition for avoiding being entirely devoured. A long, jagged scar across the bicep? That's a story. A declaration that you faced down danger and emerged victorious, or at least mostly intact. It said, "I am a warrior. I am resilient. My chances of making it to tomorrow are slightly higher than average." Forget the soft glow of health. Give me the grim, hard-won proof of having cheated death. These weren't imperfections. They were endorsements. Then we come to health indicators. While modern dating profiles might boast about gym routines and active lifestyles, in prehistory, a robust physique wasn't about vanity, it was about capability. A well-muscled body wasn't for Instagram, it was for hunting, fighting, and carrying heavy things. Clear skin, if you could even see it under the perpetual layers of dirt and grime, and the absence of obvious debilitating diseases were paramount. If you weren't coughing up blood, if your limbs weren't obviously swollen and infected, if you weren't visibly wasting away from a mysterious fever, you were already a catch. A healthy individual was a useful individual. A sick individual was a burden, a liability, and a potential vector for tribal annihilation. So your glow-up wasn't about expensive serums. It was about not having dysentery. It was about the lack of open, oozing sores. It was about being able to stand upright and not immediately collapse. For women, fertility markers were the ultimate status symbols. No, not a designer handbag or a successful career. We're talking about visible indicators of childbearing potential, a well-nourished physique, strong hips, signs of past successful pregnancies, if any children had, against all odds, survived infancy. The ability to bring forth new life was not just admired, it was essential for the continuation of the tribe. For men, it was all about strength and hunting prowess. Could you fell a large animal? Could you protect the group? Could you demonstrate the physical vitality necessary to ensure the next generation inherited those crucial survival traits? Your assets weren't about your bank account. They were about your muscle mass and your track record with a spear. And here's the kicker, the ultimate glow-up, the apex of prehistoric attractiveness, not dying. Seriously, simply continuing to exist made you an eligible bachelor or bachelorette. If you woke up this morning, if you made it through the day without being mauled, starved, frozen, or infected into oblivion, you were, by definition, a survivor, and survivors were hot. In a world where lifespans were brutally short and death lurked around every corner,
Just being alive was a monumental achievement. Oh, you're 25 and still have all your teeth? And you haven't been eaten by anything in at least a week? Marry me. Or at least procreate with me immediately before the next wave of prehistoric horrors arrives. So, next time you're fretting over a perceived flaw, a wrinkle, a stretch mark, or a slightly off-kilter eyebrow, just remember your ancient ancestors. They'd look at your imperfections and probably see a dazzling beacon of health and survival, untouched by the daily horrors that were their reality. They'd probably just be relieved you weren't actively decomposing. And that, my friends, is a beauty standard we can all aspire to. Just try not to get eaten before your next date. All right, let's peel back another layer of the prehistoric dating onion, and this one smells distinctly of desperation and dried meat. Because when you strip away all the modern fripperies of romance, what you're left with is the grim, fundamental truth. In prehistory, your worth as a partner was directly tied to your ability to contribute to the group's survival. Love wasn't in the air, it was in the successful hunt, the abundance of foraged berries, and the structural integrity of your shared shelter. Food, water, and shelter were not just necessities. They were the ultimate aphrodisiacs. Consider the prehistoric equivalent of a sugar daddy or sugar mommy. Forget lavish gifts or expensive dinners. Here, the person who found the most berries, who successfully brought down a bison, who managed to track a herd of migrating mammoths, that was the coveted partner. Oh, look at Thag! He killed a woolly rhino! We're eating for a week! What a provider. I'm suddenly finding his incessant grunting quite charming. Your value wasn't measured by your wit or your empathetic listening skills. It was measured by the sheer caloric value you brought to the communal pot, or, more accurately, the communal fire pit. Did you contribute to the collective survival, or were you just another mouth to feed? That was the only question that mattered. Relationships, therefore, were inherently contractual in their utility. It wasn't about for better or worse. It was about for more food or for starvation. If your partner stopped providing, if they became ill or injured, if their hunting skills dwindled, they quickly transitioned from a valued ally to a dangerous liability. There was no concept of emotional support in the face of dwindling contributions. The tribe couldn't afford sentimentality. If you weren't pulling your weight, you were compromising the survival of everyone else. It was a harsh, brutal calculus, devoid of sentiment. Imagine the prehistoric breakup. It wouldn't be a tearful conversation over a lukewarm latte. It might involve being quietly left behind during a nomadic migration because you were too weak to keep up. Or, perhaps, more directly,
You might simply starve to death because your partner, the designated hunter, was terrible at their job. Grog hasn't brought back anything but a single, suspiciously small lizard in 3 days, and I'm pretty sure he ate it all himself. I think I'll try my luck with... Ugh, he caught a mammoth last week. Sorry, Grog, it's not you. It's your utter incompetence at securing sustenance. There was no formal ending to the relationship. It simply dissolved into the harsh reality of resource scarcity. Your partner's failure wasn't a personal flaw. It was a threat to your very existence. The ultimate romantic gesture wasn't a bouquet of flowers. It was sharing the choicest cut of meat. It wasn't a love letter. It was demonstrating that you knew where the safest water source was. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was the implicit understanding that you would both try your absolute best to survive another day together. And if one of you failed, the other would, out of necessity, move on quickly, because sentimentality doesn't feed hungry children, and a broken heart heals faster when you're not also suffering from rampant malnutrition. So, next time your partner forgets to pick up milk, just remember, at least they didn't single-handedly cause your starvation. You could probably survive without that milk. Your prehistoric self? Not so much. All right, let's talk about the original source of relationship drama, the family. Specifically, the prehistoric family and tribal unit, which had a rather, shall we say, proactive approach to your romantic future. Forget love matches based on shared interests or a spark of emotional connection. In prehistory, your parents and elders weren't just nudging you towards someone suitable, they were orchestrating alliances, forging peace treaties, and occasionally straight up acquiring spouses through methods that would make modern HR departments spontaneously combust. Marriages, if they even existed as a formal concept beyond these two fertile individuals are now living together, were often strategic alliances between families or entire tribes. It wasn't about whether you thought your partner was cute. It was about securing access to better hunting grounds, gaining extra hands for defense, or cementing a fragile peace. Yes, young Thag, we know you have eyes for the graceful girl from the River Clan. But, unfortunately, your betrothed is the eldest daughter of the Mountain Clan chieftain, whose tribe controls all the good flint deposits. So, you'll be marrying her. And, yes, she has a beard. Deal with it. For the flint. Your personal feelings were, to put it mildly, irrelevant. The survival and prosperity of the group trumped any nascent romantic stirrings you might have had. You were a pawn in a much larger, much more brutal game of tribal geopolitics. And then
There's the delightful phenomenon of bride abduction, a disturbingly common courtship method, particularly prevalent in early pastoral and agricultural societies. Consent? That's a concept that wouldn't even begin to form in the human brain for another few tens of thousands of years, after we'd figured out things like writing and not constantly dying of preventable diseases. In many cases, if a tribe wanted a woman from another group, they simply took her, often forcefully, often violently. It was less a marriage proposal and more a territorial raid with a reproductive bonus. Imagine your modern dating app experience. You swipe right, and suddenly you're unconscious and being dragged back to a stranger's cave. Talk about a surprise first date. This wasn't romance. It was a brutal, non-consensual transaction of genetic material and labor. These decisions were driven by intensely practical needs, not romantic notions. Does this person have strong genes? Do they have a good track record of survival? Are they from a tribe that we really, really don't want to fight right now? These were the considerations. Your parents weren't worried about whether you felt seen or understood by your partner. They were worried about whether your partner could successfully chew leather into pliable clothing, or, more critically, club a charging bear into submission. These were the essential skills for a good spouse. Emotional compatibility was a distant, unreachable star. Practical utility was the sun around which your entire life revolved. The dark humor here is palpable. Imagine your parents, in their sagely wisdom, explaining their choice for your life partner. Yes, son, we know you wanted the one with the slightly less prominent brow ridge, but this one can chew through a deer hide in under an hour without losing a single tooth. And her father has a really big spear. It's for the best, believe me. Or, daughter, this mate we've chosen for you is excellent at spotting edible fungi from a great distance. And while he smells vaguely of old fish, his sister is very good at weaving baskets. It's an excellent family alliance. These weren't just practical decisions, they were life or death negotiations disguised as familial blessings. So, the next time your family asks if you're seeing anyone, and you feel that familiar pang of modern societal pressure, just remember that at least they're not arranging your abduction or forcing you into a loveless union for the sole purpose of securing better access to obsidian. You've got it pretty good, comparatively speaking. All right, let's hit the fast forward button again, a significant leap this time. We're moving into the Neolithic revolution, roughly 10,000 BCE onwards. This wasn't just a minor tweak. This was a complete seismic shift in human existence, the invention of agriculture. We stopped chasing our food and started growing it. And while that sounds like a grand step forward for civilization, it was an absolute game changer for relationships, introducing a whole new bouquet of dating-related miseries. We went from nomadic nuisances to settled strife, and it only got more complicated. Sedentary life led to new problems and, naturally, new relationship problems. Suddenly, we had property. We had fields, we had stored grain, we had permanent dwellings. And with property came the concept of inheritance. Who gets what when old Thag finally succumbs to a rogue turnip? This wasn't an issue when all your possessions could be carried on your back or shoved into a temporary shelter. Now, with fixed assets, relationships became inextricably linked to material wealth. Who you married could literally determine your access to fertile land, your share of the harvest, or the sturdy walls of a permanent mud brick house. It was the original gold digger scenario, only with less gold and more, well, dirt. Increased population density was another charming side effect. Instead of small, scattered bands wandering across vast plains, we started huddling together in villages. More people, more potential mates, right? Theoretically. But also more competition, more disease, and far more complex social dynamics. Suddenly, your romantic options were no longer limited to the 20 people in your immediate nomadic group. Now, you had hundreds, perhaps thousands, in a growing village or early town. This meant more chances to find someone who wasn't your cousin, a definite upgrade, but also more chances for rejection, for rivalries, for jealousy, and for navigating an increasingly intricate web of social expectations and hierarchies. The intimacy of the small band was replaced by the uncomfortable proximity of hundreds of strangers, all vying for resources and, inevitably, partners. The shift from nomadic, fluid relationships to more fixed, territorial pairings was profound. When you're constantly on the move, relationships can be, by necessity, somewhat transient. People come and go, often literally, as in they die or wander off. But when you're tied to a piece of land, when your entire livelihood depends on that specific patch of earth, your relationships become similarly rooted. You couldn't just pack up your animal skins and migrate away from a bad marriage. Your entire life was now here, tied to the soil. Divorce, if it even existed, became infinitely more complicated. Divorce, if it even existed, became infinitely more complicated. Splitting up didn't just mean going your separate ways. It meant unraveling a complex web of land ownership, shared labor, and social standing within a community that now had very long memories. And then came the invention of land ownership, which, in a darkly comedic twist, often made people part of the deal, often literally. A woman might be married off as part of a land exchange. A family might trade a daughter for access to better grazing lands. You weren't just getting a spouse. You were acquiring an asset that came with a claim to resources, or providing one to another family. The concept of "you're marrying into our family" evolved from a pleasant sentiment to a hard economic reality. Your romantic life was no longer just about you. It was about the acreage, the livestock, the granary. It was about the cold, hard calculus of resource management. So, the next time you're worried about whether your potential partner owns a house, just remember that your ancestors were literally buying and selling people to secure property. Makes a mortgage seem downright romantic, doesn't it? With the Neolithic Revolution came the glorious, tragic, and utterly defining emergence of patriarchy. As agriculture took root and settled life became the norm, something profoundly shifted in the delicate balance of gender roles. Women, who in many hunter-gatherer societies might have held more egalitarian roles due to their crucial contributions to foraging and child-rearing, slowly but surely transitioned from partners in survival to possessions. The concept of wives as property, as valuable assets, began its long, inglorious reign. Women became primarily valued for two things: their reproductive capabilities and their labor. As society transitioned from small, mobile bands to larger agricultural settlements, the need for hands in the fields, for processing crops, and, crucially, for producing more children to work those fields, grew exponentially. A woman wasn't just a fellow human. She was a walking, talking, highly valuable baby factory and field hand. Her worth became increasingly tied to her ability to produce sons, to inherit land and perpetuate the family name, and to contribute to the economic output of the household. It wasn't about her intelligence, her spirit, or her dreams. It was about her uterus and her muscles. This shift manifested most brutally in the emergence of dowries and bride prices. Forget the quaint idea of an engagement ring. We're talking about explicit transactions, where women were valued as commodities in tribal exchanges. A bride price was paid by the groom's family to the bride's family, compensating them for the loss of her labor and reproductive potential. A dowry, conversely, was property or money brought by the bride to her new husband, essentially a payment for taking her on, or a contribution to the new household. Either way, the message was clear. A woman's value was quantifiable, transactional, and negotiable, like a particularly fertile livestock animal. Your entrance into marriage was not a declaration of love. It was a contract of exchange, often involving goats. And because lineage became paramount, who owns the land, who inherits the fields, who continues the family name, there was an increased, often brutal, control over female sexuality. Ensuring paternity was crucial for property rights. This led to strict rules about chastity, virginity, and fidelity for women, enforced with extreme prejudice. Men, meanwhile, often enjoyed far greater sexual freedom. The idea was to ensure that the children born into a household were definitively the husband's, securing his legacy and land rights. Women's bodies became battlegrounds for control and lineage. Their autonomy eroded in the service of patrilineal inheritance. The romantic notion of my body, my choice was light years away. It was my body, the tribe's necessity, my husband's property. The bleak reality, then, was that marriage often evolved into an economic and social transaction. Emotional connection became at best a pleasant but utterly unnecessary bonus. If you happened to find a deep bond with the person you were married off to, congratulations, you hit the prehistoric jackpot. But more often than not, it was a practical arrangement. You provide children and labor, I provide protection and sustenance, and together we work this patch of dirt until we both die prematurely from a fungal infection. It was a merger and acquisition, not a love story. So the next time you're celebrating an anniversary or exchanging heartfelt vows, take a moment to truly appreciate the luxury of romantic love. Because for our ancestors, the closest thing to a wedding toast might have been a solemn declaration about the fertility of the soil and the strength of the new bride's back. Cheers to that, I suppose. All right, let's inject a delightful dose of existential dread into our already bleak romantic landscape. Because in prehistoric times, even if you somehow managed to navigate the grunting, the stench, the lack of privacy, and the forced alliances, you were still playing a terrifying game of Russian roulette with something far more insidious than a bad personality: disease and death. These were the ultimate buzzkills, ensuring that any nascent spark of connection was always under the shadow of imminent, often agonizing oblivion. Imagine finding someone who, against all odds, you don't actively hate. Someone whose grunts are less grating,
whose ability to club a wild boar fills you with a strange sense of comfort. You might even be starting to form a rudimentary bond, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of constant survival. And then, next week, they're gone. Not ghosted gone, but actually gone. A common cold, an utterly trivial sniffle by modern standards, could mutate into a deadly pneumonia. A minor cut from a flint tool could fester into a raging infection, leading to sepsis and a swift, miserable end. Dysentery. A parasitic worm. A fungal infection from a damp cave. Any one of 1,000 unseen horrors could snatch your soulmate away, leaving you alone again, wondering if it was even worth bothering to form a connection in the first place. The emotional toll of constantly losing partners and children must have been immense, yet normalized to the point of numbness. How do you form deep, lasting bonds? How do you allow yourself to truly love when everyone around you is so painfully, terrifyingly fragile? When infant mortality rates were astronomically high, often half of all children not surviving to adulthood, you learned early on that attachment was a luxury you could rarely afford. Every birth was a gamble, every fleeting moment of health a temporary reprieve. A bond was less a promise of forever and more a whispered prayer against the inevitable. It was a world where grief was a constant companion, an echo in every silent cave, a shadow lurking behind every successful hunt. And that classic wedding vow, "Till death do us part," oh, it came much, much sooner than expected. And it wasn't usually a peaceful, dignified passing in a warm bed surrounded by loved ones. No. Death often meant a swift, brutal end from a predator, a fall down a ravine, a tribal skirmish, or a slow, agonizing demise from an untreated infection or disease. Your partner wasn't just parting from you, they were decomposing next to you, or being dragged off by scavengers, or perhaps buried quickly and shallowly before the rest of the tribe had to move on. It was a constant, stark reminder of humanity's precarious place in the food chain and at the mercy of the elements. So, here's a truly sarcastic comparison to your modern commitment issues. At least your modern date won't die of dysentery before dessert, or spontaneously combust from a raging fever, or get dragged off by a cave bear while you're momentarily distracted by a particularly shiny pebble. Your worries about whether they'll reply to your text or if they're the one seem utterly quaint in comparison to the looming, ever-present specter of total annihilation. Next time you're having a deep, philosophical conversation with your partner or simply enjoying their company,
Remember that every single second of that connection was an improbable victory against a world actively trying to tear you both apart. Now, doesn't that make things just a little bit more romantic? No? Yeah, probably not. All right, let's talk about the timeless tradition of relationship drama. Because even in the primordial soup of prehistory, human emotions, particularly the ugly ones, found a way to manifest. Forget your passive-aggressive social media posts or your whispered complaints to your therapist. In a world devoid of counseling, legal systems, or even the concept of boundaries, dispute resolution often involved violence, banishment, or brutal tribal intervention. Jealousy, infidelity, and retribution were raw, visceral, and had immediate, often deadly consequences. There were no therapists in the Paleolithic, no relationship counselors guiding you through active listening exercises. If you had a grievance with your partner, if you suspected infidelity, or if someone else was making eyes at your designated mate, you didn't schedule a couples session. You might, instead, engage in a very direct, very physical confrontation. Resolution often meant a bruised ego, a broken bone, or, if things really escalated, a fatal encounter. Banishment from the tribe was another delightful option, a social death sentence that usually led to a literal one. Imagine your partner cheating, and instead of a messy divorce, they're simply exiled to the wilderness, left to face the saber-toothed tigers alone. That's one way to enforce monogamy, I suppose. Infidelity was, as you might imagine, a serious breach, often met with brutal, physical retribution. And here's where the dawn of patriarchy really dug its heels in. This retribution was disproportionately and savagely directed against women. While men might have engaged in infidelity with fewer consequences, a woman's transgression was seen as a direct threat to paternity, lineage, and the very fabric of tribal order. It could lead to severe beatings, mutilation, or even death. Her betrayal wasn't just a personal slight. It was an act against the entire male-dominated structure. So no, there were no open relationships or ethical non-monogamies being explored in the prehistoric cave. Just a very clear, very violent code of conduct. The concept of ownership extended far beyond land and resources. It very much extended to partners. A male perceived his mate as his, a valuable asset, a reproducer of his lineage. This led to fierce territoriality. If another male so much as looked cross-eyed at your partner, it could be seen as an act of aggression, a challenge to your status, and a direct threat to your genetic future. And challenges in prehistory were rarely settled with a polite debate. They were settled with clubs, stones, and a primal scream. The drama wasn't about who left the toilet seat up. It was about who was claiming reproductive rights to whom. And the consequences for getting that wrong could be immediate and fatal. And here's the dark humor in dealing with a love triangle when the only mediator is a very angry chief with a spear. Imagine two cavemen, both grunting aggressively over the affections of a single woman. Instead of a heart-to-heart, they're preparing to beat each other senseless. The chief, observing this potential disruption to tribal harmony, doesn't suggest a compromise. He doesn't offer counseling. He simply points his spear at the least useful or most disruptive of the two, making it very clear who wins or who gets to live. You, he grunts, indicating the less favored suitor, go hunt or die, your choice. Or, perhaps more chillingly, she is for him. You touch her, I will put this spear through you. A very decisive, if somewhat brutal, resolution, I think you'll agree. So next time you're navigating the complexities of modern dating jealousy, remember that at least your rival isn't likely to be banished to the wilderness or face a very pointy tribal intervention. You're welcome for that small comfort. All right. Let's tackle another delightful layer of prehistoric dating woe. The utter, soul-crushing inadequacy of communication. We've talked about the stench, the danger, the lack of privacy, but imagine trying to navigate a relationship when your language skills are roughly on par with a very articulate chimpanzee. Trying to convey, I love you, or I'm upset about your habit of leaving mammoth bones everywhere. That, my friends, was the ultimate frustration. Consider the profound challenge of expressing complex emotions. How do you articulate the tender stirrings of affection, the subtle nuances of disappointment, or the intricate landscape of your inner emotional world when your toolkit consists of, say, 50 different grunts? A low growl might mean, I'm hungry, but it might also mean, I'm mildly annoyed by your lack of contribution to the foraging effort, or I find you marginally attractive in a purely reproductive sense. The meaning was often context-dependent, wildly ambiguous, and ripe for misunderstanding. Trying to convey, you complete me, might come out as, you are good at gathering tubers. Not quite the same romantic punch, is it? Misunderstandings, therefore, were rampant. And not just the kind of benign misunderstandings that lead to awkward silences on a modern first date. These misunderstandings could have serious, life-threatening consequences. Imagine you're trying to warn your partner about a predatory animal lurking near the water source. You grunt, you point, you make a clawing motion. But they interpret it as, "Hey, there's a really good fishing spot over there. Let's go." And off they trot, directly into the jaws of a waiting saber-tooth. Your inability to articulate clearly didn't just hurt feelings. It could literally get someone killed. The stakes for miscommunication were astronomically high, turning every conversation into a linguistic minefield. The frustration of wanting to express deep feelings, but only having sounds and gestures at your disposal must have been immense. Perhaps you felt a profound, wordless connection with your mate, a shared understanding forged in the fires of mutual survival. You wanted to articulate the depth of your bond, the fear of losing them, the simple comfort of their presence, but all you could manage was a slightly more tender grunt, a perhaps less aggressive shove, a shared gaze that spoke volumes, volumes that could easily be misinterpreted as a desperate need for fire-starting assistance. The poets of prehistory were, by necessity, masters of mime and primal vocalizations, and probably still felt profoundly unheard. And so, we arrive at the ultimate prehistoric, "it's not you, it's me" scenario. Except in this case, it was, "it's not you, it's me," and my inability to form complex, nuanced sentences about my emotional state. How do you break up with someone, or even just express dissatisfaction when the very act of trying to explain yourself is a monumental linguistic struggle? You don't have the words for, "we're just on different paths," or "I need space to grow." You have a series of increasingly agitated grunts, perhaps a frustrated headshake, and then you probably just wander off to another cave. The very foundation of emotional intimacy, open, honest, verbal communication, was an evolutionary cul-de-sac that humanity hadn't even begun to explore. So the next time you're agonizing over writing the perfect text message or trying to articulate your feelings in a difficult conversation, just remember, at least you have words. Glorious, complex, nuanced words. Use them, or don't, but at least you have the option. All right, let's talk about the biological inevitability of prehistoric passion. And by passion, I mean the desperate biological imperative to procreate. Because in this era, every single date, every moment of physical intimacy had the very real, very high stakes potential of leading to another tiny human, A human who would need to be fed, clothed, protected, and kept alive in absolutely incredibly harsh, unforgiving conditions. Forget hook-up culture with its myriad birth control options. Prehistoric people were playing extreme biological roulette, often with dire consequences. The constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth was, for women, an immense physical toll, a relentless biological burden that often led to early death. From the moment of puberty until menopause, if they even lived that long, women were almost constantly either pregnant, breastfeeding, or recovering from childbirth. Each pregnancy was a life-threatening ordeal, often without privacy, hygiene, or any medical assistance beyond a few sympathetic grunts. Imagine giving birth in a damp, smoky cave, surrounded by curious tribe members, with no pain relief, no antiseptic, and the very real risk of hemorrhaging to death or dying from infection. And then, a few months later, you're probably pregnant again. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a gauntlet that women ran repeatedly until their bodies simply gave out. The overwhelming burden of child-rearing in prehistory is almost impossible to comprehend from our modern vantage point. No formula, no disposable diapers, no daycare, no pediatricians, no vaccines. Every child was a tiny, incredibly vulnerable, high-maintenance project. You carried them with you during nomadic migrations, strapped to your back while foraging. You nursed them constantly. You protected them from predators, disease, and accidental falls. You tried to keep them warm, fed, and alive, knowing full well that many of them wouldn't make it past their first few years. It was an exhausting, relentless 24/7 job that offered no breaks, no respite, and no modern conveniences whatsoever. You didn't just have a partner, you had a potential co-parent for a relentless, incredibly risky project. And here's the dark irony. Sex was primarily for procreation, but procreation was also incredibly dangerous and exhausting. It was the fundamental purpose of your existence, the very engine of evolution. Your genes demanded to be passed on. But every successful act of procreation meant an increased chance of maternal death, an increased burden on the tribe's already scarce resources, and the introduction of another incredibly fragile being into a world that wanted to kill it. It was a biological catch-22. Propagate the species, but doing so might just kill you, your partner, or the very child you're trying to bring into the world. Primitive methods of birth control were often
ineffective, dangerous, or both. Herbal remedies, prolonged breastfeeding, which did offer some natural contraception, but was far from foolproof, or, tragically, infanticide in times of extreme scarcity. The idea of preventing pregnancy for personal reasons, for career goals, or simply for not wanting kids right now was utterly alien. Your body was a vessel for the species, and it operated on a relentless biological timetable. So the next time you're having a discussion about family planning or simply enjoying the freedom of choice that modern contraception offers, take a moment to be profoundly, deeply grateful. Because for our ancestors, every intimate moment was an act of genetic Russian roulette, often with deadly and exhausting consequences. And that, my friends, is a truly sobering thought. All right, let's fast forward to the twilight years, the golden years of prehistoric love. If you were lucky enough to actually have twilight years, that is, because, and I cannot stress this enough, very, very few people lived to what we would consider old age. And those who did, they weren't enjoying a leisurely retirement cruise or sipping cocktails on a sun-drenched beach. They were often frail, toothless, and barely functional, clinging to existence with a grim tenacity. The romantic notion of growing old together was, for our ancestors, a brief interlude of utter, debilitating misery. Imagine living to be, say, 35 or 40 years old in prehistory. You were practically an elder statesman, a wizened sage, a miracle of biological persistence. But your body? It was a wreck. Decades of harsh labor, constant hunger, untreated injuries, and rampant disease had taken their toll. Your teeth would be long gone, ground down by tough roots and gritty meat, or simply fallen out from infection. Your joints would ache perpetually. Your eyesight would be failing. You'd be covered in old scars, chronic aches, and probably a persistent cough. You weren't a distinguished elder. You were a walking, breathing testament to the brutal wear and tear of prehistoric life. So the romantic notion of growing old together wasn't about two spry, silver-haired individuals sharing fond memories. It was more about two decrepit individuals, hunched and shuffling, huddling together for warmth, their bodies ravaged, their minds perhaps clouded by age and constant pain. Your shared bond wasn't built on years of comfortable companionship. It was built on shared trauma, mutual suffering, and the grim understanding that you were both just barely hanging on. Oh, look, my beloved, you still have 3 teeth and can mostly hear me when I shout. And I only cough up blood a few times a day. Isn't our enduring love simply breathtaking? Societal roles for elders
were often limited, pragmatic, and heavily dependent on their continued utility. Respect was earned, yes, from those who valued your accumulated knowledge of foraging spots or hunting strategies. But physical contribution was still highly valued, and if you couldn't pull your weight, you quickly became a burden. You might be a storyteller, a keeper of tribal lore, a child care provider for the very young. But your physical capacity was steadily declining, making you an increasingly precarious member of the group. There was no concept of a pension, no social safety net. Your value was your utility, even in old age. And the less than romantic reality of watching your partner slowly succumb to the elements, disease, or simply old age before your very eyes was a constant, heartbreaking given. You didn't just mourn them once. You mourned the gradual decay of their body and mind. You watched their strength dwindle, their eyesight dim, their teeth fall out, their body waste away. It was a slow, agonizing farewell, played out in the harsh light of the cave mouth, under the indifferent gaze of the prehistoric sky. There were no hospices, no comfortable last days. Just the raw, undeniable process of physical decline until the inevitable final gasp. So the next time you're celebrating a milestone anniversary or simply enjoying a quiet evening with your long-term partner, take a moment to appreciate the sheer, glorious miracle of comfortable aging. Because for our ancestors, the golden years were just a prolonged, painful interlude before the final, brutal curtain call. And that, my friends, is a love story for the ages. Or at least for the very, very short ages. All right, you've survived this harrowing journey through the primordial dating pool. You've witnessed the stench, the danger, the utter lack of privacy, and the sheer brutality of relationships forged in the fires of constant survival. So, as a public service, I've compiled the absolute worst dating advice from prehistory. Please, for the love of all that is decent and hygienic, do not try this at home. Or anywhere, for that matter. Unless you're trying to win an award for most likely to be eaten by a wild animal on a first date. Rule 1. Be the strongest. Or, at the very least, not the weakest. Forget personality or shared hobbies. Your primary romantic asset was your ability to physically dominate, to hunt, to carry, to survive. If you weren't demonstrably capable of defending yourself and your potential mate from the myriad dangers of the prehistoric world, you were a liability, not a love interest. A scrawny build was a red flag the size of a woolly mammoth. So, if you're hitting the gym, make sure it's not for aesthetics, but for pure, unadulterated life or death survival. Bicep curls for basic existence.
Rule number 2. Club 'em over the head, drag 'em to your cave.
The classic romantic trope, straight from the darkest corners of human history. This was, lamentably, a disturbingly common courtship method. Forget asking for a number, just incapacitate your intended and claim them. Consent was a concept yet to be invented, and certainly not a prerequisite for what passed as marriage. So, a hearty reminder, definitely don't try this at home, or on a dating app, or anywhere outside of a very specific and thankfully long extinct historical context. You will go to jail, and rightly so. Rule 3. Never shower. Everyone smells bad anyway, so why bother? In a world saturated with the pungent aromas of sweat, dirt, animal guts, and general bodily effluvia, attempting to be clean would be a futile, perhaps even confusing endeavor. Why waste precious energy on personal hygiene when you could be expending it on not dying? Your natural musk was your natural perfume. And since everyone else also smelled like a forgotten gym sock, it probably just canceled out. So put away that expensive soap. Embrace your inner cave person. Again, only metaphorically. Please shower, for society's sake. Rule number 4. Your parents will pick for you, or someone else's parents will. And their criteria won't be about emotional connection, but about tribal alliances, resource acquisition, and their potential mate's ability to chew through tough leather or club a charging bear. Your feelings were a pleasant but utterly irrelevant side note. So no agonizing over, does my family approve of my partner in prehistory? They'd already made the choice for you, probably before you even hit puberty, and it was entirely non-negotiable. It was about the flint deposits, people. Always about the flint deposits. Rule number 5. Your romantic rival? Banish them or bash them with a big stick. Conflict resolution wasn't about communication or compromise. It was about dominance and elimination. A love triangle often ended with one party literally removed from the equation, either by force, exile, or the blunt trauma of a well-aimed weapon. There were no restraining orders, just very painful, very permanent consequences for challenging territorial claims over a mate. So, next time you're feeling competitive on the dating scene, try to resist the primal urge to club your rival. Modern society has different rules. Rule number 6. Every date has a 50-50 chance of producing a baby, a 20% chance of you dying in childbirth, and a 70% chance of the baby not making it past infancy. Birth control? A pipe dream. Every intimate moment was a lottery, with incredibly high stakes for both the mother and the entire tribe. There were no casual flings without potentially severe, life-altering consequences. So, if you're worried about accidental pregnancy, just remember what your prehistoric ancestors were up against. Suddenly, modern contraception seems like a miracle. Rule number 7. Your partner will probably die soon. Don't get too attached. Seriously, the average lifespan was so short and death so omnipresent that any deep emotional bond was a constant gamble with guaranteed heartbreak. You just learn to expect it. Till death do us part wasn't a promise. It was a probability, often occurring within a few short years, or even months. So enjoy the fleeting moments, because they are very fleeting. There you have it. A rapid-fire, humorous, and darkly honest recap of the utterly unromantic realities of prehistoric dating. It wasn't about love. It wasn't about connection. It was about survival. Pure and simple, and brutal. So, there you have it. After this enlightening, if somewhat odoriferous journey into the abyss of prehistoric romance, I trust you've gained a profound new appreciation for your miserable modern dating life. While I acknowledge that getting ghosted by someone you thought was the one can feel like a profound personal affront, and deciphering confusing texts can lead to hours of overthinking, let's put things in perspective, shall we? You have flush toilets. You have deodorant. You have actual articulated language to express your feelings, even if you choose to use it primarily for sarcastic TikTok comments. You have the concept of consent, which, while still tragically misunderstood by some, is at least a recognized societal expectation. You have multiple methods of birth control that don't involve herbs with questionable efficacy or prolonged, life-threatening breastfeeding. You have the ability to shower daily with warm water and scented soap, effectively washing away the accumulated grime and existential dread of your day. You can, theoretically, find a partner who shares your obscure love for artisanal sourdough or competitive birdwatching, rather than just someone who can successfully club a deer and doesn't smell too much like death. You can break up with someone without fear of banishment or being left for dead by the side of a migratory path. You can complain about your partner's snoring without fearing that a saber-toothed tiger will hear you and decide to investigate. You have the luxury of choice, of privacy, and of a generally longer, healthier lifespan, which means the golden years don't necessarily involve losing all your teeth by 35. So, the next time you're agonizing over a Tinder match, or complaining about your partner's slightly annoying habit,
Take a deep breath, a clean, fresh, deodorant-scented breath. Remind yourself that you live in a romantic paradise compared to your ancient ancestors. Go ahead, give your modern partners an extra hug, or at least a text message that doesn't involve grunts or frantic pointing. Appreciate the simple miracles. Running water, not being eaten by a bear on a first date, and the astounding invention of the dental floss. Now, if you've managed to stay awake through this harrowing historical exposé and haven't succumbed to the urge to run screaming into the wilderness, perhaps consider subscribing. Or don't. History doesn't care. But if you do, maybe you'll stick around for our next equally depressing and darkly humorous exploration of humanity's past. Until then, good luck out there in the modern dating jungle. May your dates be hygienic, your conversations articulate, and your chances of being devoured by an apex predator remain delightfully low. Good night, and sleep tight, free of nightmares involving club-wielding cavemen and the pervasive, inescapable stench of primordial regret.